All right. So, welcome to our last online Sunday school. Starting next week, we'll be back in person. So, make sure you are watching email and the like about that. So, next Sunday is Move Up Sunday. So, that means the eighth graders will move up to high school and the fifth graders will move up to middle school. And the college students, the seniors will move up to nowhere and not until August. But, it's all good. All right. So we are finishing up, not King David's whole story today, because that would take us many more lessons. But we're kind of going to leave David at the pinnacle. We'll talk about that more when we get to the end. But when we last left off, David had just become king of Israel. If you'll remember, once upon a time, David was just a no one, a shepherd boy who wasn't even important enough for his dad to bring him to a meeting with the prophet Samuel, because he was like the youngest of 7 sons. And now, after years of uncertainty and civil war against Saul, the king of Israel, David is finally where God promised him he would be all those years ago when Samuel arrived there and said to his dad, "Don't you have another son?" David is the king of all Israel. But being a shepherd boy and being a king are not the same thing. Being a general and being a king are not even the same thing. So today we'll see how David kind of handles that transition in his early days of being king. How does he handle going from general to king of all Israel? So we're going to open our Bibles to 2 Samuel 5. Now, before we read it, let's remember that at first what we talked about is David was only king of Judah, which was only one tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that's his tribe. Saul was from Benjamin. David was from Judah. Because of that, his capital was in Hebron, a place that was solidly in the territory of Judah. But once David became king of all Israel, he was looking to move his capital to a place that might be considered more neutral. He set his sights on Jerusalem, which was solidly in the lands of Benjamin. Saul was of Benjamin, so this would sort of be a concession to the people of Benjamin. Now, it's hard for us to imagine the same way, but where capitals are is super important. Like today, maybe it doesn't matter as much to the capital of the United States as in Washington, D.C. You can just hop a plane ride and from anywhere in America be there in like 4 or 5 hours, except from Hawaii. That's going to be longer. But back then, they didn't have planes or trains or cars. Rich people had horses and camels, but the average person would just be walking everywhere. So having a capital near you was having power. This is why there was such a debate in the United States when it was settled. When we won the revolution and the revolutionaries, became the founding fathers, and the founding fathers were arguing about where to put the capital, right? There's a whole song in Hamilton about this, being in the room where it happens. Hamilton is wheeling and dealing, and part of that deal is where to put the capital. And for Hamilton, it was, he wanted the banks to be in New York, so he conceded the capital to the south. So they placed it between Virginia and Maryland, right, on the Potomac, which back in that time, Maryland and Virginia were considered part of the South. Now it's questionable. So this is a political move, both when the U.S. put Washington, D.C. where it is, and when David put Jerusalem, or made Jerusalem the capital. He didn't put Jerusalem where it was. It was already a city. Unfortunately for David, there are people already living in Jerusalem, and they're not Israelites, and they're not willing to give up their city. Because if you'll remember, Israel, there were Philistines, there were Canaanites, there were other groups who were not Israelites in that area, especially under Saul. The Philistines were encroaching further and further on the land and taking things back. But today we're going to talk about Jebusites. So 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10. 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 10. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back. thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David had said on that day, whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city all around from the Milo inward, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So these Jebusites are living in Jerusalem at this time when David decides he wants it. But the Jebusites are not worried. Jerusalem is well fortified. It's a walled city, but it also has some geographic benefits protecting it. It would be a hard city for an invader to take. Because of that, the Jebusites are so confident. They're like, we're so awesome. We don't even need to send our best men to defend us. We'll send our blind people and our people who can't walk. They'll be enough to protect us against your pathetic army. But their taunting doesn't work. David still comes to Jerusalem and he overtakes it. Here's where it says stronghold of Zion. Just know that Zion in this context is Jerusalem. Zion can mean different things in different contexts, but in the story of King David, when someone says Zion, it means Jerusalem. Sometimes today when people say Zion, they mean Israel. Sometimes today when people say Zion, they mean heaven. So it can mean different things in different contexts. But right now, Zion is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is now the capital city of Israel. And as it says, David becomes greater and greater because God is with him. Wow, I didn't even move the slides. You guys, here are the verses. All right, 2 Samuel 5:17-21. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David. But now David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? The Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. So David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. He said, the Lord has burst forth against my enemies before me, like a bursting flood. Therefore this place is called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. If you guys remember, when David was on the run from Saul, there was a point where David left Israel and lived with the Philistines. While David was only king of part of Israel, while he was just king of Judah, the Philistines pretty much left him alone because they viewed him as an ally. And an unstable split Israel was for the benefit of the Philistines. And they viewed him as an ally because at one point he'd been living and working with them. So they would be like, well, Israel's over there, Judah's over here, Judah is our friend, and we can fight Israel, who cares? But when David became king of a unified Israel, he became a threat to the Philistines. They wanted the lands and the people of Israel. They knew it would be best if they attacked David early in his reign, therefore, before he was really solidified, so that that would be when he was weakest, right? So that's what they did. They invaded Israel. David, meanwhile, asked God if he should attack them. And God was like, yep, go ahead. I've got your back. So David ran the Philistines out of his land, defeating them for now. The Philistines then try again after this, but David defeats them again handily. All this shows that David is a strong leader in general. He's been a general for a while. And back then, being a strong general was important to being a strong king. He is making Israel a mighty stronghold. He is unifying the country. So, 2 Samuel 6:1-7. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is... Actually, I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna go back. I'm just gonna mention something really briefly. And Trevor, if you have additional opinions on this, please put them in the chat. But there's a lot of Israel and Palestine in the news right now. And one thing I want to make clear is that the Philistines and the Jebusites are not the same as Palestinians. Just so we're clear. They're different people group. They're a much more ancient people group. Some of the old people groups went extinct and some of them got absorbed into other people groups. Because this whole Middle East land has had a lot of, I mean, it's one of the most ancient areas of the world. So there have been a lot of people groups. Even after this, right? The Jebusites and the Philistines, they're going to get completely absorbed into the Assyrians and the Babylonians, right? And then even way after that, you're going to have Alexander the Great, who comes in, and he's Macedonian, but that's like North Greece. And he comes in, and you have Persians, and this is all pre what we would consider modern, like people of the Middle East, which is usually, you know, people refer to them as Arabic now, right? So Islam didn't even come along until the Middle Ages, right? So these people are all pre that, and you can't just draw a line from the Philistines to the Palestinians. So that's really all I'm going to say on that topic. But I just wanted to add that, and I just want to make, you know, there's been war in the Middle East forever. If this teaches us anything, it is that, right? We had, you know, judges, right? We had Abraham, like, you know, war is everywhere in the world, right? All the time. And that particular area of land, the land that the Bible considers Israel, that we talk about, that's between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, has been a hotly contested spot for a long time. It's been conquered by everyone from the Philistines to the, you know, Persians, to the Romans, to, you know, I feel like the British at one point, though maybe not. It's hotly contested. So I just want, you know, you can't take Philistine and interchange it with Palestinian. I just want to make that clear, because that can be confusing when we look at the Bible. All right, so now we'll go on to 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 7. 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 7. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was built on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. So, now that David is solidified in Jerusalem, he decides to bring in the Ark of the Covenant. If you guys remember, the Ark of the Covenant is this intricate, large golden box that houses the Ten Commandments, amongst other things. It represents God's presence in Israel, so it's very important that the object that is viewed... So it represents God's presence in Israel. So it's a very important object. And this object is viewed as God's home, right? Because this is pre-temple. This is when we have the tabernacle, which is like a tent church that can move around. So the ark is the seat of God, the seat of Israel's power. So they are moving the seat of God into the political seat of Israel, the Israelite capital, which is Jerusalem. That's why David brings it there. It's all symbolic, right? Moving God's symbol to the political symbol, so it's all in one place. So everyone is celebrating and so happy and dancing in the streets as the ark comes in, and something happens completely random, and an oxen spooks, right? The ark gets unbalanced, and this completely just random guy reaches out to steady the ark so it doesn't fall over. Boom. Uzzah is struck dead where he stands. Doesn't seem fair, does it? This guy had the best of intentions. He was trying to help the Ark of the Covenant. Why would God punish him for that? Well, for that, we have to go back to Numbers. Numbers 4:15. When Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary as the camp sets out, after that the Kohathites shall come to carry these. But they must not touch the holy things, or they will die. These are the things at the tent of the meeting that the Kohathites are to carry. For this guy to touch the ark is literally illegal according to the law because he's not a priest descendant of the line of Aaron. You remember that Aaron was Moses' brother and basically the first high priest of Israel. By touching it, Uzzah technically defiled or tainted the ark. But it still seems unfair. And we're not the only people to think so. David has a very similar reaction. This is a very human reaction. So 2 Samuel 6, 8 through 11. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. So the place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. So David is angry at God for killing Uzzah, but he's also afraid. Because if God could kill Uzzah for just trying to help, what else might he do? And it seems that David was afraid of the Ark of the Covenant, so he refuses to bring it into Jerusalem. He stops that symbolic act, right, of the seat of God being in the seat of political power. Personally, I think this is a completely reasonable reaction. It's very human, right? The Ark of the Covenant is not a toy, and it must be taken care of in accordance with the law, or else. So David leaves the ark in this place of Obed-Edom. And while it's there, God blesses this entire place, even though Obed-Edom doesn't seem to be an Israelite city, right? This guy, Obed-Edom, is a Gittite. Edom can be used as another word to mean descended from Esau, so not an Israelite, though still Abrahamic, right? Yeah, David's just like, that thing's like a nuclear bomb. I'm not bringing it into my city. Let's leave it out there. 2 Samuel 6, 12 through 16. 2 Samuel 6, 12 through 16. It was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And with those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So, someone reports to King David about how Obed-Edom is being so blessed because the ark is there. And it's been 3 months, so David's like, well, okay. No one's died in Obed-Edom for these 3 months. They're being blessed. So I guess we can bring the ark into Jerusalem. So he does, and it's a huge party once again. David is dancing in the streets. He's wearing an ephod, which is like not a formal outfit. And his wife, Michal, sees him, and she thinks he is ridiculous and horrible. Why? Well, you may not remember, but at one point, Michal loved David. They were very young then, and this was when David first came to Saul's house, well before he was king. She was Saul's daughter, and she begged Saul to let her marry David, so they were allowed to marry. But then Saul got super angry at David and wanted to kill him. Michal loved David so much that she was really willing to risk her life to help him escape the palace. But then David was gone, and she was left there. And Saul was mad, so he gave her to another man to be another man's wife. She was with this man for years, while David was out fighting battles. When David came back to be king of Judah, he bartered with Saul's former commander to get Michal back. But maybe she was happy in that life. Maybe she didn't want to come back. She was given no choice. Nobody asked her what she wanted. So here she is living a life she doesn't even seem to want when she sees David making a fool of himself in the streets. At least that's how she sees it. 2 Samuel 6, 17 through 23. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So David puts the ark in a place of honor. There's a huge party still with food being handed out to everyone. And then he goes home to like a party with his family. Instead of partying with him, Michal comes out to meet him and she is super upset and basically tells him his behavior was shameful. And David was like, "I was praising God and dancing before him. I would do anything for God. I would be more ridiculous than this if it would please him. And everyone would think well of me because they'd know I'm doing it for God." The conversation ends there, and the next line is about how Michal has no kids. Now, it's likely Michal has no kids because at this point, she's probably older, right? I mean, if she and David married when they were young and he's out battling for, 10, 20 years, I don't know. A lot of time has passed since she was a young woman who married David. But narratively, the writer is implying she has no kids because of her lack of faith. The writer is trying to tell us here that David's unabashed joy before the Lord is good and right. And it doesn't matter how ridiculous other people might think you are if what you're doing is for God. So if you're singing for God, it doesn't matter that you can't sing well. Because God doesn't care. To him, it sounds pleasing. It doesn't matter if other people think you shouldn't sing. It doesn't matter if people think it's beneath you to dance if you're doing it for God. 2 Samuel 7, 1-3. Now when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See now, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." The last prophet of the Lord we talked about was Samuel, but there is a new one on the scene. His name is Nathan, and this is the first we're hearing about him. So one day, in a time of peace, David is talking to Nathan, and he's like, "It seems strange that I built this amazing palace for myself, and I'm a mere human, when the Ark of the Covenant, which represents God on earth, is in a mere tent. Surely God should have a better house than his mortal servant, right?" And Nathan is like, you have a good point, dude. Let's do that. But it becomes clear very quickly that in this moment, Nathan is just speaking his opinion and not God's opinion, because we're going to see in the next verses that God sees things a little differently. 2 Samuel 7, 4-11. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went. I have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. And evildoers shall afflict them no more, as formerly, from the time I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. That night, God speaks to Nathan. And he's like, whoa, hold up. Why are you, David, the one who's going to build me this house? Did I ask you to do this? No. The Ark of the Covenant has never lived in a house. And I'm cool with that, because I needed to move with the people who were on the move. I've never asked anyone to build me a house. So don't worry about this. Remind David that I've always been with him, and I will make his name great, and I will make sure the people of Israel are solid in their land and no one affects them. I, God, am making a home for you, my people. I don't need you to make a home for me. Moral of the story here is that God doesn't need David or any human to take care of him. He's here to take care of us. But God's not done talking yet. 2 Samuel 7:12-17. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. God continues by saying that someday when David dies, he will raise up David's kid to be king after him, and God will establish his kingdom. That kid, the heir of David, he will be the one God will let build his temple. And God will never take his love from him or back away from him like he did Saul, because God is planning to establish David's line forever. So Nathan goes back and tells David all this. And David is maybe a little bit bummed, because he won't be the one who gets to build God's house. But he can't be too disappointed because God has made him such a big promise. So David literally spends the next section praising God and saying how amazing God is and how awesome it is that God has chosen him. 2 Samuel 8, 1-4. Sometime afterward, David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. David took Metheg-Emma out of the hand of the Philistines. He also defeated the Moabites and, making them lie down on the ground, measured them off with a cord. He measured 2 lengths of cord for those who were to be put to death and 1 length for those who were to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also struck down King Hadadezer, son of Rehoboam of Zobah, so he went to restore his monument at the river Euphrates. David took him from 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung all the chariot horses and left enough for 100 chariots. This entire chapter is about David being an awesome warrior in general, and it makes me tired just to read it. Leading the Israelites to victory over and over and over again over their enemies. David is an amazing leader, and he is amazing for Israel. It's been a long time since Israel has been this victorious and strong. But a person can be a good military leader and a bad person. So let's see if that applies to David. 2 Samuel 9, 1-4. David asked, "Is there still anyone left at the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant at the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. The king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." The king said, "Is there anyone remaining at the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness, the kindness of God?" Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." But the king said to him, "Where is he?" Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lo-debar." One day, David is thinking about the most bestest friend he ever had in his entire life, Jonathan. If you'll remember, Jonathan was Saul's son and David's best friend forever. Such good friends that the Bible calls them soulmates. Jonathan died in the same battle his father did, but David had sworn an oath to Jonathan that he'd never harm his descendants. There's a difference between swearing an oath never harm someone and wanting to go out of your way to show kindness to his kids. But that's exactly what David wants to do. He finds a servant of Saul's family and summons them. And he's like, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can do something for?" And the servant's like, "Yeah. One of Jonathan's sons is still alive, but he can't walk. Apparently he had some sort of accident in his younger days that led him to not being able to walk. Back then, this would be a bigger deal than it is now. Now we have wheelchairs and other amazing technology to help people walk, even if they're paralyzed or missing a leg. But back then, they didn't have anything like that. Not being able to walk meant that you couldn't work, couldn't provide for your family, and a lot of people who couldn't work ended up as beggars." Now, in this case, it doesn't seem like this guy was a beggar. It seems that his family's taking care of him, but it's still a precarious position to be in. 2 Samuel 9, 5-8. Then the king sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lo-debar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. And David said, "Mephibosheth." He answered, "I am your servant." David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." He did obeisance and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I?" David brings Jonathan's son into his house and basically makes him part of the family. And Mephibosheth is amazed by this, thinking he's not worthy, but also thinking that he probably thought David was going to kill him, right? Because he's like a direct line to Saul. But David wants to do right by Jonathan's son to remember his best friend. This goes to show that David wasn't just a good leader politically and militarily, but he was a good person. It's easy to see why God chose him for this position and why David is remembered as a great king. But David was still human, and so he made mistakes. And if we were picking up with this next week, that's where we would be picking up. I don't know if we'll be doing these lessons this summer. It may not be for a while. It may not be ever. I'm not really sure what the plan is for Sunday school. But if you continue reading 2 Samuel, which I would encourage you to do, you'll see David messes up a lot. You see this a lot with kings. You see this a lot with tragedies. And David's kind of the framework for a lot of those tragedies, like Arthur, and other great kings, where things start out so well, and then as they get older, things go off the rails. And that's because we're all weak and we're all human. But what's important about the fact that David made horrible decisions, like did terrible things, is that he, was still remembered as a man after God's own heart. We are all sinners, right? And no matter what we do, God still loves us, and we can still come back to him as long as we repent, which is a major difference between David and Saul. Saul never repented. Saul always doubled down. Saul always thought he was right. But David eventually, always in the end, saw the wrong of his ways, not Saul, and repented and came back to God. So next week is Move Up Sunday. We will be doing it at church, physically. So please join us. And then this summer, we will probably be doing other activities. So that is the end of the recording, and then we will do prayer requests.